Welcome to the Black Methodist for Church Renewal Northeast Jurisdiction webinar on the spiritual, physical, and mental health in the Black community. I'm Reverend Shayla Johnson, the NEJ BMCR coordinator, and today you will hear from three professionals, Reverend Irance Reddix McCray, Dr. Deidre Williams, and Dr. Deborah Haskins. Reverend Irance Reddix McCray is an ordained elder in full connection with the Baltimore Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church and a family practice physician for 31 years. Reverend Reddix McCray is also the CEO of the Adullam Community Healthcare Center, LLC, a nonprofit primary and behavioral health center which she founded. Dr. Deidre Williams is a doctor of social welfare and demonstrates her work philosophy, where she employs a level of mindfulness, commitment, and respect to the treatment process to create settings that respect all identities. She successfully published a book chapter, Shared Traumatic Stress and the Impact of COVID-19 on the Public Child Welfare Workers in Shared Trauma, Shared Resilience During a Pandemic, Social Work in the Time of COVID-19, the first known volume on COVID-19 published under the editor-in-chief of Clinical Social Work Journal, Carol Tassone. Overall, as a psychotherapist, supervisor, and teacher, Dr. Williams encourages a collaborative treatment dialogue and experience. Because of the many settings she's worked in are restrictive, she is dedicated to countering the narrative of learned helplessness. Dr. Williams exemplifies a hands-on approach to her work to create a space of building understanding, validating, and being curious of the narratives, lived truths of others, to build accountability and address patterns of internal and transgenerational discords. Her dedication to building foundations and addressing disparaging gaps in systems, her work is around supporting the individual and/or unit to remain vulnerable and authentic. Dr. Deborah Haskins is a counselor educator who designed curriculum and pedagogy to educate professional counselors, psychologists, social workers, and mental health professionals. She specializes in cultural competence in counseling, wellness in faith and spiritual-based communities, disordered and problem gambling, homicidal loss, and grief and loss recovery. Her clinical specialty also includes adverse childhood experiences and trauma. Dr. Haskins is also the founder of Mosaic Consulting and Counseling Services. Her personal mission is to support mental health practitioners in professional development and equip them with the tools to maintain a high level of competency both in practice and in self-care. We hope you are enlightened and encouraged through their presentations and begin the process of addressing your holistic health and healing. The word tells us in the Voice translation of Jeremiah 30, verse 17, "For I will make you well again and heal your wounds. I, the Eternal One, declare to you." Therefore, listeners, receive the word and teaching presented with joy in knowledge and wisdom to move forward into better health.
Excerpt from the Creation by James Weldon Johnson. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river, he sat down with his head in his hands. God thought and thought till he thought, "I'll make me a man." Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river, he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand. This great God, like a mama bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay till he shaped it in his own image. Then he blew into it the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen and amen. This is a poem by the civil rights activist NAACP member and writer of Lift Every Voice and Sing, James Weldon Johnson. I quote this poem because it encapsulates who we are as a people, the truth of who we are. This great God, like a mommy bending over her baby, kneeled into the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image, then blew into it the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen and amen. We so often forget that humanity is composed of body, soul, and spirit. In our community, our bodies and minds are so often traumatized that we forget that our spirits are also affected. Our body is the physical aspect of us. Our soul is our mental part, and our spirit is the part and the element that is most like God. Our body is intertwined. Every system has to work for all of our body to work. If you don't believe that that's true, stub your toe right now. And if you do, you'll find that everything in your body hurts. And that's because everything is intertwined, and one part of your body affects everything else. Your head, your arm, your heart can even be affected. Medical science has long purported that African Americans are subject to certain diseases like hypertension, high blood pressure, and diabetes and heart disease, that we have genetic predisposition to certain diseases. That may or may not be true, but really what medical science is doing is only trying to describe the results of what they see, not the hidden causes of the things that they're trying to determine. It is widely known that conditions like hypertension is affected by what we eat, specifically sodium chloride, salt, and other unnatural preservatives that negatively affect the cardiovascular system. We are truly composed of what we eat. In our communities, we eat foods that are higher in sodium chloride and preservatives. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, those are the cheaper and more easily available food sources. So therefore, what we eat makes it so that we have more salt in our diet. But the foods that are better for us, that are fresher, that are lower in preservatives, are also more expensive and are easily spoiled. This is because we, most of the time, live in a food desert, and it's more difficult to obtain things that are fresher. Our community is affected by everything that we do and that we eat. We are more prone to have things in our diet that raise our blood pressure and raise our heart rate. Following closely with hypertension is diabetes. You see, diabetes is the inability of the body to either produce enough insulin, or if you have enough insulin, to be able to use the insulin that you have to metabolize the sugars and carbohydrates that we eat. Recognize, too, that carbohydrates, when we eat, let's say, French fries, are then produced and turned into sugars into our bodies. The same foods that are high in salt are often high in sugars and carbohydrates. So therefore, when we see one, we often see the other. It is also well known that we have other hormones that help our bodies. One of the hormones that we have is adrenaline or epinephrine. That is the hormone that causes our heart rates to beat, that our minds to race. It is part of the fight or flight phenomenon. In that adrenaline is always produced when something happens that makes our metabolism speed up. Unfortunately, adrenaline is also released when we are frightened, when we are afraid, when we feel like we have to fight. This fight or flight phenomenon causes our sugars to rise as well and causes our blood pressures to be high because we need more energy if we're going to fight or flee from an enemy or stand up and fight the enemy. A lack of fuel causes dysfunction in these release of hormones. The other hormone that is released is cortisol. Cortisol and adrenaline go hand in hand. Neighborhood stressors, including crime, lack of general neighborhood safety, lack of good food sources, neighborhood upkeep, barriers in transportation, and difficulty in time management also raises our adrenaline and our cortisol level. Problems with employment, child care, community source services, all of those add to the external stressors on our body, which keeps our body in balance. When the heart is affected, so is the liver, the pancreas, the kidneys, the gut, and everything. There is nothing that is spared. Our minds, too, our mental part, are the key. They are the key to our health. Whether you believe you can't or believe you cannot, you actually are right. Our minds are such a machine, a complex machine. It's actually an organ in the body that controls the entirety of our physical body. Now, recognize our minds are not our brain. Our brain is not our mind. Our brain is the organ that functions and on auto control. In our brains, our hormones are produced, they're stored, they're released without us thinking about it. Think about it. You don't think that you have to breathe. You don't think that you have to make your heart race. Our brain causes our lungs to breathe in and breathe out, and our hearts to race in a specific rhythm. It causes our muscles to contract when we're ready to do something or run, and our eyes to constrict to focus. But our mind is under our control. Unfortunately, when our minds are active and affected by the fight or flight phenomenon, then our brains release those hormones, that cortisol, that adrenaline, that get the body ready to fight or to fly. Whether positively or negatively affected, our minds are uniquely affected by our environment. Our minds is the first thing that lets us know that we are in God's image. Why? Because in our minds, we have something that lower animals do not have. It's called choice. Our minds can choose whether to react or not. Our minds can choose whether to rest or to fight. It's affected by external circumstances. We can ignore them or not. It takes an act of the will of the mind to keep the body in balance. In our minds dwell our souls, our personalities, are who we are as a person. Our personality is centered in our minds. Our likes and our dislikes are centered in our minds. Our minds are the place where we are educated. Yet, there is so much more to our humanity than our minds. Our soul is the place where our bodies and our minds touch. Our bodies can influence our souls and our minds, yet our body is not, and our mind is not overwhelmed by the influence of the Spirit. The brain needs our fuel as well. However, it is an organ. Physiologically, it is not as important, really, as is the heart, as is the liver. So if something happens to your heart and your liver, you really can't live. But if there's not enough fuel or good fuel, guess what? The body shuts off unimportant organs, such as the brain, the skin, and the kidneys. So if you don't feed your body well, your brain becomes foggy and you really cannot think clearly. The third part of our body is the spirit. The spirit is the one part of our being that we cannot completely control without God. Our spirit is a God-given gift. When we come into existence, God breathes into us and puts a portion of God's self in us, and we become a living, thinking being. Spirits do not necessarily mean that it is our intelligence or not. Our spirits are the part of us that can come in direct contact with the God Almighty, like Jane Weldon Johnson said. When we are born, our spirits are pure and uncluttered. Unfortunately, as soon as we have any type of experience, then our spirits starts to gain clutter in our lives. With that experiences, we can actually still choose. Remember, we have choice, whether it's good or bad, positive or negative. Our spirits have the unlimited capacity, however, unlike the body, to heal, because our spirit can be connected directly to the divine. In our spirit lay our intuition and our discernment. In our spirit, our feelings can be influenced. Our spirits, by design, are light, but they can be darkened by the repetitive darkness that we experiences and trauma. So why do we take so much time parsing out the body and the soul and even talking about the spirit? We are, first of all, what we eat. We discovered that. We are what we think we are. But more importantly, and in actuality, we are what God says we are. Our environment actually dictates, and it can dictate what we eat and even possibly what we think. We've been subjected to so much trauma and disparity and hurt and injustices. However, we are much more than our trauma and our environment and our injustices. The reason people break free from our environment and from our boundaries that are in and set before them, because they can no longer see the boundaries as keeping them. They don't see them as prohibitive. They can see so much further than their physical and even sometimes mental limitations. Many of our ancestors have survived because of generationally there is an underlying stick-to-itiveness and survival instincts and intelligence that greatness bubbles over and overwhelms that systemic injustice and cruelty that cannot be overcome. That connection of the spirit to the divine has always let us survive despite our overwhelming negative odds. The old adage says, it takes a community to raise a child. But I also believe that it takes a childlike dependence on the community to raise itself others. We begin with foundational changes, such as improved nutrition and more food access, and access to clean water and clean air and transportation that allows us to have employment. Then we understand that our strength is in the community, in community advocacy, in community help, especially healthcare. No one knows us better than ourselves. And when we have self-determination and self-discipline, we can then create a community that boundaries are limitless, and we can better guard ourselves against the trauma. Understand that we as a people have been traumatized. We have been marginalized. They attempt to keep us in a box. However, there is an intellect and an intelligence that cannot be overwhelmed by circumstances. Recognize and remember as well that our children truly are our future. And with our children, we elders have to teach them. We have to give them a script, a foundation, a guideline of what is good and what is not. You can't assume that they understood what is good and what is not, what good foods are, what good habits are, what good sleep is, what good education is. So yes, it starts in our community. It starts in feeling and knowing that the spirit that is alive in each and every one of us, who God speaks to and talks to at all times, would rise up and say, I will help. I will educate. I will create a community garden. I will help in after-school care. I will help take my neighbor so that they can have good health care. I will help get their medication so that they can be healthy. And let us determine to choose not to be mediocre. Choose to be the best that we can be. And remember, just like the poem that I read at the very beginning, when God scooped us up into clay, that God breathed into us God's life. And so inside of each and every one of us is God's life and the ability to not only help yourself, but to help others. So breathe that life that is in you, the God life, into our community, that we may begin one person at a time. Let each one teach one. And then we can begin to overcome the systemic trauma and racism and dysfunctionality and injustices that are perpetrated to us daily. Amen and amen.
Hi, my name is Dr. Williams, and I specialize in working with court-involved individuals and persons with a history of homelessness, child welfare placements, and confinement through psychiatric hospitalization, juvenile detentions, jails, and prisons. As a clinical and forensic social work manager, adjunct professor, and CIFI instructor, my social work philosophy is to employ a level of mindfulness, commitment, and respect to the treatment process to create settings that respect all individuals. Today, my presentation is called Black and Brown Youth Matter, Aligning Values and Practices with Court-Involved Youth. I love this quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates in the book Between the World and Me. It is a clear symbolism of my experience of Black families within the judicial system. It says, Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us endangered. When I think a lot about the families that I've seen marching through rooms that look very much like this one, I think of all the harm that this room and the room that it symbolizes cause. And much like many families where there are unwritten rules, where people understand and children understand a lot of the unwritten rules of their home, at least by the age of 3 years old. Like mom gets them dressed in the morning, makes them breakfast, dad might take them to school. This room is a symbol of power and oppression. The haves and the have-nots. As you clearly indicated in the structure, there is the judge's seat, which is above everyone else's, which is an indication of absolute power. And then you have the pews in the back, which are more of the onlookers, where they also have no power, but yet they have a bit more power than the tables at the center. And then you have the tables in the center where there's a person being judged, and another table where there's accused. And think of it being a 13-year-old boy sitting in front of a judge, being accused of a crime that would be considered a crime if he were an adult, where he was only able to sit next to his attorney, likely someone he didn't really know, and his parent or guardian or family member was only able to sit in the back. And how distressing that could be to feel like you have absolutely no support and no power. To wait for this person sitting on this pedestal, this judge, to make a decision over your life can be extremely harmful and disarming for a young person to have to rely on their entire future based on one person and their paternalistic views on who they are and how they show up in the world. I've often seen so many times a disproportionate minority representation within courtroom settings, where there are judges and attorneys actually, and paralegals and so many other court staff who do not appear to be people of color, but are representing people of color quite frequently, and the harm that the system causes by not being able to allow a person to be able to share their own story and how they entered into this room. Actually, there's a lot more to what I see in the courtroom, and I wanted to give a video on what that looks like. And so that's actually what I'll play now. These families that have to work with young people and to live with young people and to care for them, especially as they're going through difficulties or growing up into adults. And I think a lot about how our values about adolescent development and developing a moral code and a sense of responsibility is really important. However, we do not demonstrate that through our action as a society. As a society, even though we are very solution focused, we bypass the root of the problem in an effort to address effective solutions and resolutions within the carceral system, because our implicit biases impedes reform efforts. Did you know that we routinely and systematically penalize non-white youth between the ages of 7 and 17 at higher rates than white youth? Were you aware that 12,000 youth are serving sentence for life imprisonment? 80% are youth of color and 50% are Black. It's astronomical to think that the overall non-white youth population is 38%. However, when we look at detention rates, that means the Latinx population is 64%, the Black population is 43%, and the American Indian youth are 34% between 1997 and 2007. Delinquency court cases of non-white youth rose 56% in 2018. This is very, very significant, and if this were not to drive home further, between 2003 and 2013, we saw that overall adjudication of youth in the carceral system was 40%, decreased by 47%. However, non-white youth court involvement rose 15%. There are disparate judicial treatment of youth, not only like the example that I provided earlier about life imprisonment sentences, but also of shackling of youth, which actually exists within 32 states and DC, where youth are shackled hand and feet quite often in many of the states, where shackling is actually deemed for an adult in a carceral system as a flight risk. So not only are we indicating to our young people that they are a flight risk, but they are not in control of themselves and their movements. They're not in control of their own lives. And it brings shame and guilt to them, which actually causes more trauma. As a social worker, I learned that it's not just about the person or the environment, it is about the person in the environment. Oftentimes, the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual factors of a person intertwine with one another. But for right now, I'm going to give specific examples of each and every single category and the negative cognitions, the negative thoughts that are associated through racial trauma that exists for people. From a biological standpoint, thinking about skin color alone, young Black males teen boys are often perceived as adults, older than they are because of their stature. But in actuality, they're teenagers. They're children because they're still developing. But they are not being perceived as such. Or young black girls are often hypersexualized in schools, asked to redress themselves. The things that they often could think about based on these examples is that they're not valued based on who they are as a person, but more so of what they look like. A psychological example I provided earlier around shackling, and some of the negative thoughts that someone might have about themselves because they are being shackled is that they're dangerous, they're a flight risk, or it reinforces that they're bad or not to be trusted, or they're not worthy of being treated as a child. They can't trust themselves or their judgment, and they can't protect themselves. Socially, in America, there has been a history of criminalizing blackness, where people have been killed by the police for little to no cause. That has been leaving the black community to feel that they are less than, they are not human, or in other words, that they are powerless. They have no control over their lives and what they can do. They are unsafe, and they're not deserving to be protected. They're invalid. They're not in control. And a spiritual example is really just about a lot of the black traditional African beliefs, like the idea of being connected or talking to the dead, seeing them in your dreams, or thinking about a person and thinking that their spirit is around you. In the mental health community, in my community, it can be deemed as psychosis, instead of being explored appropriately and actually being asked whether or not this is something that is a part of their belief or their experience. That could really leave someone to feeling very ostracized. Racial injustice extends to many institutions. I only narrowed my focus for this presentation based on the carceral system, but it exists within police contact, school to prison pipeline, child welfare systems, and many, many more systems where there is a disproportionality of youth being targeted based on the color of their skin. And there are things that the church can do to support the efforts of reform. On a grander scale, there's a way that a congregation can gather together to create effective change. Thinking about only one of the many frameworks, like the Truth and Reconciliation Framework, where all parties can sit together to talk about their narratives, their truths, their experiences, so that true healing can happen, inviting everyone to a space. Or the church can be able to gather together as a community, to band together to create some sense of project and help towards police reforms, like the efforts that are made in police alternatives in Oregon with the Cahoots Project, or to advocate for the differences in the police misconduct under the color of law, or to advocate for there to be transparency in the use of force, even to ban religious and racial profiling, work on research-based policy changes, or even attend restorative justice training groups in various settings. On a micro level, individuals can counsel other people by including more self-reflection of themselves, having an internal dialogue and thinking about how it is that you're showing up for other people based on how you present yourself, whether you're white, you're black, you're Asian, or any other identity. Normalizing a person's experience of sitting in front of you is so deeply important. Are you able to bring up race as someone's coming to you and talking with you in fellowship? Are you able to actively tolerate a conversation about someone's narrative around their racial trauma, or just about their race and their experience in who they are as a person? Are you able to hold an environment to create brave spaces for people to come to you and talk to you about uncomfortable conversations? Is everyone allowed at a table? Is everyone allowed to have conversation together? I think a really big part of what we can do as a community is to help others reconceptualize not only their experience, but also their self-worth through radical curiosity. There are some resources from psychotherapy that we can think about. There are so many different therapeutic and counseling methods, including short-term or long-term therapy, supportive counseling, CBT, anger management, solution-focused therapy, EMDR or other trauma-informed therapies, and many, many more. Whether it's to address the cognitive, the behavioral, or other things, or a combination of things. Always know that there is help. There are other resources out there for you. You can contact a therapist today at Psychology Today, Hello Alma, Therapy for Black Girls, Silence is Shame, ZocDoc, or even speak with your local doctor. There's no shame in seeking out additional supports and additional help, knowing that this person can be able to support you through their training and their understanding, always knowing that you can shop around. That is completely okay, because sometimes it's a best fit, a best person, a best intervention, a best time, and a best place. And for any questions that you might have, feel free to reach out. If you're seeking therapy or wanting a referral, you can reach out to DearDiaryPsychotherapy.com. I just want to thank you for your time. My name is Dr. Williams. Have a great day.
Hi, I'm Dr. Deborah G. Haskins, and I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and a lay servant. And I'm excited to do this presentation today on Black trauma, breathing through historical, racial, cultural, and COVID-19. The body keeps the score. The learning objectives for this session are: increase understanding about racial, cultural, COVID-19, and life traumas affecting the Black community. Identify multiple layers of trauma, impacts, and how the body keeps the score, and healing opportunities. And learn resources to support the Black community to heal and breathe through experiences of trauma. How prevalent is any trauma in the Black communities? Lifetime prevalence of exposure to any trauma for racial and ethnic minorities actually varies by the ethnic group. And unfortunately, it's no surprise that African Americans comprise one of the largest prevalent groups affected, 76.3%. When you look at other ethnic and racial groups, you'll notice that the prevalence is smaller. So if you're Black and live in America, in the African diaspora, and other places, you are just breathing through traumas. Enough is enough. So what is trauma? A traumatic event involves a single experience or what we call enduring repeated, which means it continues, or multiple experiences, not just one, that completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. Regardless of its source, trauma actually contains three common elements. First, it was unexpected. You had no preparation for the event. Someone took your loved one's life, or you were sexually violated. You didn't anticipate it. The person was unprepared. And then lastly, there was nothing the person could do to stop it from happening. The event or events happened to you, you had no control over it. Some people will develop what we call PTSD. Many of you may have heard this term, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, but not everyone will develop that. So what is PTSD and how does it affect African Americans and people who are Black and African descent? We actually see PTSD highest among African Americans, close to 9%, followed by Latinas and Latinos, Latinx community, and lowest among Asians, for example. So many people will ask this question: what happens when trauma goes unsupported because the body actually keeps the score? What do we even mean by the body keeps the score? It means that when trauma happens, it affects your body. It affects your mind, your spirit, your heart, but your body is containing all of the trauma. And so what is complex PTSD? Because oftentimes when the body is keeping the score, a lot of signs and symptoms and things happen. What do we see? We often see that a person will have altered attention. They can't focus because the trauma event or events continue to disturb their memory and their present and how they are experiencing life. Oftentimes they will have physical symptoms, what we call somatic distress. They may have headaches, they may have pain, they may feel sick in their stomach, nausea. Oftentimes they will be hypervigilant. What do we mean by that? That means they're really sensitive to the environment and to triggers. So for example, when they see continued police brutality playing out in their communities and in the world, they are triggered because they have experienced a traumatic event. And that then intensifies their emotions and the physical and the spiritual even results and outcomes. They may also experience avoidance of these reminder triggers. And so they don't want to be in the community. They may isolate. They may isolate themselves from family members and loved ones because they're avoiding whatever that triggering event that was traumatic for them. They oftentimes will have flashbacks. And what is a flashback? They will remember, and their memory and their mind will take them back to that traumatic event and events. And it becomes hard for them to sort of function in life because they're continually experiencing the trauma again and again. It also will affect their belief systems. And what do we see there? That means that whatever they believed about the world becomes very altered. It's like, well, how could this awful event happen to me? I was just an innocent person and someone violated my body. I didn't do anything wrong. I was this innocent child, or my loved one was murdered. And it alters how they feel about the world. And that can also affect how they feel and perceive their faith in God and spirit, because they may question, well, God, if you're all knowing and everywhere, how could you allow this to happen to me, to my family, to my community? And then they oftentimes will experience difficulties in relationships, because when trauma happens, it affects a person's trust in the world, trust in themselves, and trust in other people. And one of the biggest outcomes we see is they may have difficulty regulating their emotion. Think about it. When trauma happens, whether it's a single event or multiple events, it happens and you had no control over, it becomes difficult to manage your emotions because this awful event or events has taken over your body, your mind, your spirit. You might ask, what are the experiences of trauma and adversity, I would add, that affect or is affecting Black communities? We can't start talking about trauma without starting at the beginning with the middle passage. Many of you know what the middle passage is, but let me remind you. The the Middle Passage was not confined to the United States because our brothers and sisters abroad also experienced colonization from the British. And when you travel and speak with other African brothers and sisters, they also share similar themes in their context. Europeans introduced trauma to Black peoples, but left them without the necessary resources to breathe through. And we cannot count on others, especially from the dominant culture, to save us. We rely on our God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit to help us. So let's talk about historical trauma for a moment. What is historical trauma? Historical trauma is defined as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding as a result of group traumatic experiences that is transmitted across generations within a community. And so even though slavery happened years and centuries ago, it affects people of African descent. And why? Because the trauma didn't start or stop there. There's continued trauma, and it's part of our physical DNA. It's part of our biochemistry, and it becomes more intensified with further trauma. We didn't create trauma and adversity. Trauma created us. When we look at this tree, for example, we see that there is diseased roots. And what does diseased roots create? It creates dis-ease. So I want to talk about this for a moment, because how do these experiences of trauma also show up in the Black community? We now have more information about what we call adverse childhood experiences, because a lot of the traumas occur also beginning in childhood. And so you will see in this visual a tree, and adverse childhood experiences was the product of a major project that was done through the Centers of Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. And they did this project about 10 years ago. And what they did is they surveyed 17,000 Kaiser Permanente members. And the racial demographics of this sample was largely European descent persons. And they asked them, have you experienced these experiences of adversity during your childhood? Was there maternal depression? Was your mother depressed? Was there physical and emotional neglect? Did your parents or caregivers separate or experience a divorce? Was someone in your household living with a mental illness? Was anyone in your household incarcerated? Had anyone in your household experienced homelessness? Was there domestic violence or interpersonal violence? Was there incidents of substance abuse by any of the caregivers? Was there emotional and sexual abuse? And what they found in this sample was that if a person answered at least one event happened in their childhood, that they experienced future chronic health conditions. And so the question in this particular study, which is pretty phenomenal, is that when you think about it, if this is true of a largely European descent, materially resource sample, because many of these individuals were middle class, then what do we see in communities of color? And so what is pretty astounding in this study is that we see that childhood adversity actually predicts future health problems, chronic conditions. And so we want to understand, how can we address these sooner? So how do these experiences of adversity and trauma affect us in the Black community? It affects our health. And so what's really interesting scholarship now is that we can't just focus on adversity at the individual level. We have scholars such as Dr. Dietz and Ellis from George Washington University in DC, who has expanded the model to say, wait a minute, we have a lot of Black folks who experience community adversity. And what do we see there? We see high fat and high sugar diets. We see a lack of safe spaces that they're living in. We see a lack of breastfeeding. For example, one of the projects I'm involved in is with the WIC program, launching and supporting their Breastfeeding Buddies program so that Black women and other women can understand how breastfeeding can actually support your infant from birth and sort of shore them up health-wise. We also see, in terms of community adversity, a lack of access to healthy foods. If in your neighborhood there's a food desert and all you have is high sugar content and high processed food content, it's no surprise that there's future chronic health conditions. We see a lack of portion control. We see people living sedentary lifestyles. We don't have police athletic programs in the communities anymore. We don't have recreation centers that are fully resourced. We have physical spaces that don't even have basketball courts with nets, for example. And so people really aren't physically active, and we're doing more computer work and gaming, particularly among our youth especially, but also adults. And so people just aren't physically active anymore, which then leads to future health conditions that are not health promoting. So Black folks always knew we are affected by the roots of dis-ease. Adverse community environments that evolved when our families and communities were and are disrupted, beginning with slavery, the continued impacts of white supremacy and modern day slavery, such as mass incarceration, poor public education, poor infrastructures that don't provide adequate transportation for Blacks to get to jobs even, under-resourced public education, a lack of livable wage jobs, non-existent viable post-high school opportunities. But now research well documents that there are chronic health conditions resulting from these community dis-ease. So the challenge is we really must address adversity and traumas to turn it around for our communities. We also know that war-related trauma exists in the Black community. Many of us are familiar with veterans who come back and veterans who are serving. And so we also have to understand how that impacts. Lifetime prevalence of exposure to trauma resulting from exposure to war, political violence, or war-related events among African Americans is pretty high also as you compare it to other communities. And this includes our veterans and armed forces that are surviving every day. Our African brothers and sisters who are from war-torn countries, even up to today. I remember my good friend, Reverend Justice Reeves, who told me in the 90s, "My mother cries every time she speaks to me by phone when I call her in Liberia because she doesn't know when or if she will ever see me again. Because she knows if I ever set foot on Liberia's soil, I will be killed." He was involved in the politics prior to leaving for America. And so we know that there are a lot of people who experience political-related trauma as well as service in the armed forces, and they need our support as well. So we also want to focus on interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence is very prevalent, not just in the Black community, across all communities. But we see that the lifetime prevalence of being a victim of intimate partner violence, we call it, also exists highest among Black women. We also see that Black men also are affected, so we don't want to forget about our brothers. We have data about cisgender men and women, but what about people who do not identify with either male or female gender? We know that many Black persons who are gender nonconforming, along with other communities of color, are also victims of violence due to homophobia, heterosexuality, and a lack of tolerance and a lack of support by their families, friends, and communities, including the church and the Black church. My question is, didn't God love all his children? Well, Black trauma also includes violence against anyone who does not identify as cisgender. African descent and Pacific Islanders have the lowest rates when we look at the statistics. So we have to do more to help people understand how to manage stress and distress and not to take it out against the people that they love and that they're friends with and community members with. Physical assault. More than 40% of Black women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime, but we also know that men are victims too. According to the 2011 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, approximately 41% of Black women, which is astounding, have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner during their lifetime, compared to 31% of white women, 30% of Hispanic women, and 15% of Asian descent or Pacific Islander women. And in this report of the National Center for Victims of Crime, they found that 53.8% of Black women had also experienced psychological abuse. And the psychological abuse is oftentimes missed because we don't see the physical signs. But we also have Black men who are victims, and they suffer in silence because of models of masculinity, which they don't feel comfortable letting anyone in their personal life, let alone outside of their personal circle, know that they are breathing through physical abuse or even sexual abuse by an intimate partner or friend. So, rape, let's talk about this. I heard one person say recently, who was African descent, let's not sterilize the term. We call it sexual abuse. What really happened is I was raped. In the United States, 38% of Black women experience sexual violence other than rape during their lifetime. Among students, 11% of Black girls in a national high school sample reported having been raped. This was a study done by Thompson, McGee, and Mays in 2012. So research well documents that Black women suffer higher rates of obesity and diabetes, and often these health outcomes are linked to sexual assault. Women and youth may develop a relationship with food and or substances to self-medicate this violent injury to one's spirit, heart, and mind and body. They engage in overeating, and often as a way to make them less attractive, to more abuse. And research documents that often rape sets them up for future abuse. Because if one's boundaries are violated and the Black woman never learns what is a healthy boundary, they feel shamed, etc., they may unconsciously get future partners who abuse them too. They often don't recognize the patterns. Let's talk about a subject that's even more difficult for many of us in the Black community: suicide. Suicide affects the Black community also. Black adults reported a past year's serious thought of suicide, a past year's suicide plan, and a past year's suicide attempt. And while faith can be a protective factor, we see, persons of faith also commit suicide. Suicide is often considered by the person as an out. They don't see a way out, and so they really believe that not being here is best for themselves and their family members. Among Black populations, suicide rates peak during adolescence and young adulthood and then decline, whereas among other ethnic groups, suicide peak in later life. The highest suicide rates are among American Indians and Alaska Natives, almost 11%, followed by Latinas and Latinos, 6%, and Pacific and Asian descent, 5.9%, almost 6%, and African Americans, which is 5.5%. compared to the overall U.S. population. Another form of trauma is child maltreatment. Child maltreatment, what do we mean by that? We mean anytime a child is mistreated. That could be physically, that could be sexually, that could be emotionally, that could be even through neglect. The child not having adequate food, shelter, caregiving, supervision. And we want to be careful because sometimes child maltreatment is not intentional. It could be the condition of family adversity and effects of community adversity. But when we see child maltreatment, we always and oftentimes see that it's a result from stress, substance abuse, a person's in-the-moment response. But often there's also generational diseases of maltreatment modeling learned behavior in the home and or in the community. Blacks don't have a genetic disposition to child maltreatment. That's a myth. We prize our children, but we have to figure out how to address roots of maltreatment earlier and provide families supports and resources before they take matters into their own hands. Community violence is out of control. The average rate of victims of violent victimization, which includes rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, simple assault, committed by strangers, is highest among African Americans, 13.3%. All of us are affected by community violence. I thought homicide happened to other people before it happened to us. I'm also breathing through community violence twice as a homicidal trauma survivor.
From Kenosha to Louisville, police shootings not only impact families, they traumatize entire communities.
People who are living close to where the incident happened, they may miss school, they may miss other experiences like work.
Dr. Deborah Haskins is a licensed clinical counselor who specializes in community wellness. She says people who repeatedly experience community trauma are much more likely to develop mental health issues that include
clinical depression, stress-related reactions, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Police-involved shootings from Minneapolis to Louisville have had a profound impact on entire communities.
We're talking about a major assault to a person's being.
Dr. Deborah Haskins is a licensed clinical counselor who specializes in community wellness. She says children are especially traumatized.
And now with virtual education, your teacher is asking you a question, but because your mind and your being is clouded from trauma, you can't really even process anything else.
Stephanie Gaines Bryant, WTOP News.
I heard one of my colleagues, a school counselor practitioner, Dr. Diane Reeves, she made this statement. She said, COVID-19 blew the curtains wide open to racial trauma and social justice and injustice in August of 2020. So COVID-19 is here. We're breathing through this. It's also traumatic. COVID-19 opened the curtains. How? We have been able to ignore the gamblers, the affected others. I'm a gambling disorder leader, but also people in general, people who are breathing through life every day, struggling, trying to make it, and their communities that have often these experiences every day that no one paid attention to, that social injustice happens out there and that these injustices affect all of us, that everyone does not have the same privileges, that Black and brown and other persons of colors, cultural and lived realities are not important data to understand and include in our pastoral care support and our mental health delivery programs and our health delivery and our health equity supports and our public school and private school education, whatever it is. It's not okay to ignore people. And COVID-19 now has offered us an opportunity to make help more accessible. And so what we want to do is we each have to take responsibility to think of new and creative ways. As a result of COVID, we're doing that to support the 93% who may not access, for me as a clinician, our clinical treatment programs for trauma and mental health and distress, or if they're struggling in life in your community as a pastoral care leader and supporter. Basically, what we're seeing is that COVID created the perfect storm. The American Mental Health Counselors Association in July of 2020 published a white paper. And what did they document? They stated that they projected that more than 103 million adults in the United States, and what is that figure? About 4 in 10 persons will experience a negative mental health or behavioral health condition and or will develop a co-occurring substance use disorder in 2020. What else did they predict? They predicted that they estimate that 8 million to 24 million children, that's astounding, ages 5 to 17 will suffer from a mental health condition this year as a result of COVID. And so we're seeing more and more adults and youth develop traumatic experiences as a result. So we can't discuss equity and inclusion regarding COVID-19 and racial and social injustices that boiled over in 2020 and the economic downturn. We can't discuss it without understanding how COVID-19 has affected the Black community and other communities of color. And so we're seeing more and more people struggling. So what's happening in COVID-19 pandemic? Black people have the highest COVID-19 statistics. Disproportionate COVID-19 outcomes have terrorized the Black community. Death rates since the beginning of the pandemic causing Black people to actually lose 3 years of life expectancy. Black people have the highest COVID-19 death rates since the beginning of the pandemic. Many Black people, especially older adults, lack the equipment to access online COVID-19 resources. So the question is, so how can we respond as BMCR? So what is the response? We need culturally specific outreach. What is this? We want to permit persons to sign up for COVID-19 testing and vaccines in person rather than exclusively online. Having COVID-19 experts, for example, directly visit Black neighborhoods to provide information about available resources, as Black people tend to trust word of mouth more. For Black and brown communities, COVID-19 can be considered somewhat of a genocide that has ravaged our communities. We need to make sure that there's equity when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines and testing. So as B. White highlights too, that the life expectancy of our Black communities is closely tied to the government's failure to provide COVID-19 resources and culturally specific information to the Black community. So while we are advocating for change, we can fill in the gaps ourselves as BMCR to problem solve these gaps and create these culturally specific outreach efforts to our communities. So just as trauma happened and we couldn't wait for the government and others to save us, we have to step up and continue to lead the way for recovery and support for our communities. Because ethnic minorities are exposed to the highest rates of trauma, and they are less likely to receive adequate mental health treatment as well as health treatment due to service barriers and the lack of culturally specific treatment providers that they feel they can trust. So what we know is that Black and African descent persons and other ethnic minorities experience higher rates of trauma. It's not just one trauma. They have multiple traumas. What is hard is that they may walk around depressed, struggling without getting sufficient support. Think about it. If our arm is broken off and we don't get medical attention, then we lose function in the arm or at some point. If our mental and spiritual selves are broken from trauma and multiple ones break us even more, what are we going to do about that? So we want to get folks linked to help. Research documents positive associations between trauma and symptoms in ethnic minorities, such as delinquency among our youth, aggression among youth and adults, truancy among our youth. They stop going to school because if you're experiencing and breathing through trauma, you can't focus, you can't think, you can't organize. Somatic symptoms, binge eating, substance use, suicidal thoughts, risky sexual behavior, depression, psychotic symptoms, and anxiety, and a host of other mental health challenges and conflicted racial identity as well. Because this is what we see, especially whenever there isn't earlier help to treat the pain or support the pain. We also know what happens to our Black men. We know that Black men are feared and invisible. This is a powerful quote by Ralph Ellison. Many of you are familiar. He stated, "I am an invisible man. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible. Understand simply because people refuse to see me." And what is the spiritual, psychological, and physical effects of being invisible? Many. What we see is that racism is so dominant. If you are Black in America and in other parts of the globe, and you walk around and experience and breathing through the effects of colonization and white supremacy and racial trauma, I state this quote: "It doesn't matter how many degrees we have. When we walk out into the world, they see me as Black, and that will create many reactions from people who don't see our vibrancy, see our intellect, see the richness of our community, see our hearts, see our spirits." And so what can we do? Harriet Tubman said, "Lend a hand." If you see the mural located in Cambridge, Maryland, you're going to see her reaching out her hand. You might ask how, or you are supporting congregation and community members breathing through the best way they know how, and they are quite diverse. We know that a person's response to trauma is influenced positively and or negatively by a number of factors. Their developmental phase, for example, children who lack the capacity developmentally will struggle often more. And if they haven't developed resiliency compared to adults who may have. Also, if the child or adult has developmental concerns that got in the way of their ability to process the trauma, to understand it, and to get support. Or it also includes a person's ego strength. What do we mean by that? If a person is not healthy in their reality already, then trauma can compromise their ego, which is their personality, their ability to function in the world. It also includes a person's coping skills or lack of, a person's lack of support. For example, a former client who was 8 said to me, "I found God by walking into the church." This client had an absent father, an alcoholic mother, and guess what? God became her mother and her father. It also includes a person's adaptive resiliency or not, a person having access to the material resources to get mental health treatment or health treatment. And we know that Blacks have not embraced a mental health or health system that's not designed by them or for them. We don't trust research. we feel stigmatized, and we are often pathologized by media, education, the criminal justice system, and every other system. So why would we participate in a process or system or relationship that adds more stigma to us? So this is where the Black Methodists for Church renewal comes in, because they can trust you or another brother or sister. Let's link them to support. And so what is our call to action? What advocacy or pastoral leadership are we going to use to help a person in a community? Clergy or lay know, and clergy do this in sermons oftentimes, that there are 3 points. I remember my dear husband, Reverend Dr. Bruce Haskin, who was an amazing pastor and preacher. He would say, "Deb, what did I preach today?" He would jokingly say, "I know you were asleep." Well, I remember the 3 points, and I want you to remember these 3 points. Point number 1, offer support, listening without judging or pressuring the person. Let the person or family or community member know that how they are feeling is actually normal for an abnormal event. Because guess what trauma is? Trauma is a normal response to something that has happened abnormal. And so what people generally feel is something is wrong with me. And so what we want to do is create a safe place just to receive them, to listen to them. Don't rush them through the process of recovery, because trauma has already accelerated life, accelerated their body, their mind, their spirit, their heart. So you can have children in the same family, and each of them will have their own unique experience. The body keeps the score uniquely. Point number 2, be careful, as I stated already, not to pressure the person to talk about the event. If they are not ready, it could actually scare them, frighten them, or re-traumatize them. I want to say a little bit more about this, because a lot of times what people think is going to help the trauma survivor is to actually talk about it. Well, guess what? We have research now that highlights that talking about it doesn't always help everybody. It actually can re-trigger and re-traumatize the person. And think about it, when a person has experienced trauma, they're not just talking about it once. For example, when there's community violence or a homicide that has happened, people are coming to you and having this urge to ask you really direct questions. They want to know when, how, what, and details. For the person breathing through trauma, they don't have the emotional strength and the spiritual strength or even physical strength to do all that cognitive processing or emotional processing. So when we have this need ourselves to talk about it, that's our need, not necessarily their need. So when a person is resisting that, don't pressure them. Ask them, what will help you now? I'm here as a listening supporter for you. Then point number 3. This is one of the most important points, I believe. God provides mental health resources. Help them find supports also in their community that can include mental health resources, that can include homicidal trauma support groups. It could include in-person support. It can include online support. It could include their pastoral care provider or layperson, whoever. It could be a family or friend who now is understanding trauma better. Help them find supports also in other parts of their life. As I stated, faith and spiritual community, support groups in their community, and other supportive people in their existing social networks. I often tell people to avoid people, places, and things that create more stress for you. But I'm offering them suggestions and resources. Know when to help them with these resources, and don't stress them with unnecessary resources that compromise them even more. Because guess what? The church is the hospital for many, but we also have to provide our community with community ICUs. You might be asking the question, what if a person needs more help? Here are some practical guidelines. If you see that their recovery is stalled, they're not moving, or they're not moving at all, or they're struggling with going to work, going to school, staying focused, they're having difficulty being in their community because of the community violence that is continually triggering and creating more stress and distress. If you see that there are physical or other symptoms that are causing you concern, they are not eating, and so they're declining. They have no one to talk to, or relationships in their personal networks are insufficient to support them. They have continuing emotional responses that you're really concerned about. There might be severe responses. They have continued inability to sleep. They're having nightmares that are causing them the distress, so they can't even rest. Because guess what? At night, this is where our body, our minds then are slowing down, and that's when you start to think about the events of the day, the events of the week, the events of the trauma. And so that can be a very difficult place for people. They can't handle intense feelings or experiences, or if you're seeing that they're gambling, they're engaging in drug use, opiate use, alcohol, or any other substance or behavior at excess that is creating more harm to them. And so I always want to encourage us to think outside the box, according to Haskins. I often think that many people, even though I highly recommend mental health treatment and see a therapist, and I get people connected to therapists who are culturally competent and people who understand the Black community, I often will start with bibliotherapy. For example, a recent book by S.L. Hughes, author, is titled Keep Your Pecker in Your Pants. It's a sexual trauma book written by a survivor, which is very good, authentic, compassionate guide that some folks may benefit just from reading literature because they have more control over how they read, how they access it, and they can self-manage their symptoms or their behaviors or their reaction in a safe place. We also have access to podcasts that can be supportive for people, maybe some of your sermons. Music has always been central in the Black community and African cultures, so music can be very therapeutic. I oftentimes will send songs from Pandora's or off the internet to people who are grieving or breathing through trauma because music heals the soul. Also dance it out or box it out or some type of physical fitness that gets that out of your symptom in a good way. I'm a walker and I walk daily. Just moving your body is a way of shedding whatever is storing up in your system. And so lastly, I want to share with you some other resources. If you're looking for a mental health supporter in your community, this is a mental health treatment facility locator, and there's a toll-free number. There's also a link in English and Spanish that you can access, and they can get you linked. Also, for African Americans specifically, a wonderful resource to find a therapist is the Therapist Resource Directory that is under the Association of Black Psychologists. The Association of Black Psychologists is a professional membership of Black psychologists and clinicians who are committed to African consciousness and the African-centered mission and values and worldview, and focus on liberation psychology in the African community. This is a great brochure called Racial Trauma in Coping and Healing. I love it. I encourage all clinicians and pastoral lay, as well as clergy and any health provider, to actually have this in your virtual office, online, or have it visible in your physical spaces so that when you are providing support to a congregant or a community member or someone accessing your professional services, they see that you get racial trauma, you understand it, and you are going to support that. And these are some recommendations that are listed. And I would actually have some of these brochures available in my place of service. Another resource is a great one. We're doing more on mindfulness. The average person may not want to use this particular book because it is pretty lengthy. There are some online YouTubes that can introduce mindfulness, but for some of your folks who are open to reading, this is a great book where it takes them through how to be centered, and it uses a racial and social justice paradigm to support mindfulness. Another good bibliotherapy and reading is Healing Racial Trauma by Sheila Wise Rowe, The Road to Resilience. This is a great resource written for a Christian consumer. I would definitely recommend this for clergy, for pastoral leaders, and laypersons. You can easily modify the reflection questions that she uses for a non-Christian or person who is not aligned with a Christian identity. This is the book that I mentioned, Keep Your Pecker in Your Pants. This might be, interesting for some of you who would say, wow, that's really quite a title. Well, guess what? This author really means it. If you're thinking about touching someone, a male or female, keep your pecker in your pants. And she takes you through her own journey of recovery. And so this is another resource. Lamentations and Hope card deck is another great resource. If you're working with someone in your community, this is a great card deck that contains 62 scriptures concerned with the phenomenology of human suffering and security from what some know as the wisdom books of the Bible. You can order this right from Dr. Nyasha Grayman Simpson's website and get access to it. And I love, there's so many other, these are just some that I selected. You can think of other creative ways to support people. But the body keeps the score. Let's continue to help people breathe through life, breathe through trauma, breathe through adversity. Thank you.